granular shocks through production networks. Granular shock meaning shocks to single units, firms, or sectors. How do they propagate through the complex interlinkages of input-output that we call the production network? Until recently, fiscal policy was completely outside the radar. So government spending, G, in our models, is typically thought as the purchase of homogeneous goods isomorphic to GDP. And yet, as we know now much better than before, G is actually concentrated in very few industries. And over time, it can change, it can widely vary the set of industries where governments spend their money. Think about early 2000, military builds up, or 2020, 2022, right? All the health spending due to the COVID pandemic. So a key question for both our understanding of the economy and how they work, and for policy, is how the production network propagation depends on the structure of the network, and so how sectoral shocks to fiscal spending can actually propagate through the economy. Okay. Now, this is a personal policy design and production question, and it's also informing, this will be less relevant for a policy institution, but the working of the network models that we are seeing mushroom in academia. I should add that, trying to make it more relevant also for a policy institution as we are, if you think about stimulus, then it's very important to understand if you have different multipliers in different sectors, right? So this is one of the questions that, for instance, we will explore in this paper. Before, let's start though setting terms, okay? So what are the terms that I'm going to use in case the production networks is not your bad butter? So imagine a simplified Arabic, let's say, because it goes from, from the right to the left production network, which is a linear production network, saying where at the center, you have the aerospace manufacturing industry. The numbers are the nice codes running through. So our interest in this paper, because we have so many data about the single transaction that the contract level the US has been signing in the last 20 years, is to understand what happens to the industry, which is the recipient of the contracts from the government. What happens to their suppliers, for instance, electric power or iron and steel mill. And so this will be what we will call the upstream effect. The effect of industries who are upstream to the recipient. And then we will ask what happens to the industries which are actually downstream of the recipient. So industries which are actually customers of the industries that receive government spending. Okay? So obviously, in reality, the network structure of economies, especially the United States, is much more complex than this one, right? This is so obviously air transport uses electric power and iron as well, right? So of course, it's going to be more complex, but just to set terms, I want you to understand these basic ideas. So what do we do in this paper? So we ask the following question. How does the granular public spending propagate along the supply chain? So how do quantities and price respond in recipient industries, the air manufacturing? What are the effects upstream? So the industry supplying intermediate inputs to G recipient. So for you, if you were attentive, is it air transport or iron? Air transport or iron? Who are the upstream effects? The electricity. Very good. And then what are the effects downstream, right? On the cost. Then we will ask what are the implications for aggregate outcomes, like the GDP multiplier. Okay? So we analyze these questions empirically. How do we do that? We start from a very rich micro data set for the United States. We have information on more than 70 million contracts that the US government gave out in the last 20 years. Yes?
You just look at the goods or also investments?
Oh, very good question. It's both goods and services, although you see that, you see in a second which are the recipients, but it's a full network. It's a very good question. So from the USA spending, we construct sectoral spending measures, okay, at the most aggregated level possible. And then, and this is, of course, this is going to be like the core of the methodological contribution that we bring to the table of the literature, is we propose a way to identify sectoral spending shocks at 4 digits. We will mutuate some work that me and Matteo did in the past in the context of protectionism, and we discuss how we do that. And then, after we are armed with the sectoral shock, we estimate industry level response of employment, price, and wages, as I said, in the recipient industries, upstream and downstream. Finally, because of the richness in the micro procurement contract data, we use, for the first time in fiscal policy, the granular IB to estimate aggregate effects of fiscal spending and also how these effects can differ according to the attributes of the industries that receive the spend. So if, as John needs to go, this is the slide. In a week, I will send you this slide, and I will check if you are really attentive to my seminar. And after this slide, you can leave, actually. So the first result we have is that we find sizable and positive effect on employment and output in the recipient industries, probably not surprisingly. So this is the manufacturing of airplanes. Second, we find what is called upstream crowding in, which means we find positive employment and output effect on the suppliers of the recipient industries and on their prices. Third, and slightly less obvious instead, we find what we call the downstream crowding out, which means that we find higher intermediate prices across production networks and therefore lower employment and output in the downstream industries, in the industries which are actually the customers of the recipient industries, right? Linked to a price effect. So it's very logical, but it's not what the literature has been argued so far we should have found. Last but not least, we do find positive aggregate fiscal multipliers. Oh, wow. I didn't know we should have waited. Where is that?
Did you say you're a timekeeper?
So if you don't mind, we spend 1 minute going back to what we're doing, because otherwise, if you lose me, it's not nice, right? You know, sorry. So what we are basically doing in this paper is to have a lot of data on each contract that the US signed with private companies to ask the question of how fiscal spending propagates through the production networks. And so with 70 million contracts, we are going to ask the question, what is the effect of this spending on the recipient industries? So the industries where the contract is signed, for instance, aerospace manufacturing. What is the effect upstream? Upstream meaning the suppliers of this industry, for instance, iron and steel and energy power. And what happens downstream? So in the customers of these industries, for instance, air transportation. And by the way, I should say that the Latin said repetita juvant. Who knows, apart from Carmelo, what repetita juvant means? That if you repeat, things get clearer. So I hope that also for the people who were here before, by repeating, things got clearer. So what do we find? We find, so that we can all go for coffee. We find that the effect of public expenditure on the recipient industry is positive, both in employment and in prices. That the effect on the cost on the suppliers is also positive, both in employment and in prices, but the effect on the customers is negative in employment because of an increase in intermediate price. On the aggregate, we find evidence of a positive fiscal multiplier, but also, I was saying here, you arrived, all of you, when I was saying, but heterogeneity matters. And this is actually also maybe a policy relevant point. So meaning, we find larger multipliers when recipient sectors are more downstream or have stickier prices. The intuition for the downstream should be clear for what I said before, because if the idea is that now when I spend on an industry, all its suppliers are also experiencing positive effects, the more my spending is downstream, the more it will also drive these upstream effects, right? So the more I spend downstream, ideally, if I spend on services, then these services requires a lot of manufacturing, so the aggregate effect is larger. Of course, this is a purely positive issue about the impact on outcomes. It's not a discussion about global supply chain security or critical intermediate input. No, we are abstaining from all of that. But if you think about the simple results I gave to you, it's very logical to say that then if government spending is concentrated on industries which are more downstream in the production networks, then its other aggregate effect is larger. Yes?
Question. So, in case in which the spending in G is focused on upstream sectors, can effect number 3, the crowding out, be strong enough to offset the crowding in of the, so that the effect of the G is just temporary?
No, that is. I think it's a little bit too rough our analysis to get to that. I should also say that this paper is going through a huge revision, so anything you can say it's very welcome. But and we are adding a model to that because you need a model for that, right? So you need a model to calibrate and to see whether effectively that possibility is a case that on aggregate then you have a lower multiplier because you're spending more on upstream, which is very interesting. Because if you're saying now all of a sudden we want just to think about the security of global supply chain, key critical input, and we want to spend money on that. If you're thinking that this might have this maybe slightly counterintuitive crowding out effect downstream, that's another factor that should be considered, right? So, very good question.
There's a question. I guess you observe the distribution of government spending across all these sectors, right? So,
yes.
Are we going to see like a picture of?
Yeah, lots of stuff. Yeah.
And the question is like, at the beginning, why the government then choose to allocate the government spending in, let's say, in upstream sectors? Is because they have another?
No, it's more downstream, if anything, right? And what I'm saying is that now the discussion is a lot about protecting sectors a little bit more upstream, not the global value chain. But that's for after the policy section in some sense. But anyway, so is it clear for everyone? Yes.
Sorry if this is going ahead of your presentation, but on the last point on larger multiplier,
yes,
or more downstream, how does this compare to spending by like a private sector, for example?
That's a great question, and I have no idea. Sorry, I'll be very blunt in this thing. So if everything is clear, then John can leave. I hope it was clear, like more or less what I'm doing. Very good. So you can leave safely. We can have a coffee in DC. So in terms of literature. This stuff is new, but connected to many strands of the literature because we had twice the introduction. If you don't mind, I'll skip it. And I'll just jump into the data. So we'll have data, identification, the results, and the aggregate effect. And I promise still, I commit to 12 p.m. So USA spending, by the way, this is all public information, right? So the US puts online 70 million contracts, and it tells you everything: signing date, duration, when the work begins and ends, the various amendments, etc. What do they include? So if you think about the government as spending as government consumption and investment, then the database we are using is actually have all the private intermediate purchases of the government and all the expenditure on structures, equipment, and software of the government. It's about 45% of federal consumption and investment, which is roughly 50% of overall G, local and federal. So these are the type of things that Agostino was curious about. So which are the main recipients, right? So where the government spend the most money. So aerospace product and parts manufacturing is number one, but then you have a bunch of services, right? You have, not surprisingly, scientific research and development services. Something's not working. Sorry. Just give me a second. I won't repeat the third time for the people online. So I cannot restart the third time.
Sorry, all yours.
Thank you. Okay, so as we said, granularity, right? These are only 25 industries out of 459, and yet they account for 70% of total spending, right? So these are the main recipients of government contracts, and they're fascinating things. So if you want to know, Lockheed Martin received $550 billion from 2001 to 2019, and in every quarter, a bunch of $1 billion, except for one quarter, which I think is the moment where they forgot to play golf, right? So now, if you fix those 25 main recipients, what are the main suppliers and the main customers of those 25 recipients? Yes, we have a question.
Question is like, do you have information whether it's an outlay or maintenance?
So very good. How this is actually computed, right? So the one I'm presenting you now is committed, and then it's split over the length of the contract, right? It's a flow measure. So if the government award a $1 million contract for 1 year, it's divided 4 quarters, it's $250,000 per month. This is what the literature does. Now, our kind referee told us, okay, that's fine, but we want also the other version, which is like with the full money immediately, right? It's the award of. There is not really measures of outlays, though, right? So these are the committed amounts. Very, very good question. You are in this. Maybe you are the referee. Very good. So these are the main supplier. These are the main customers. Again, you have much more downstream customers, as you should expect, right? In this case. But maybe the picture that you want to see, Agustin, is this one. So it's easier. So basically here the idea is fix the 25 main suppliers. And for each of the 300 plus industries, here what you have is the red color is the importance of these 25 industries as customers of the industry, and is ranked by the importance. That's why it's called upstream. Upstream means the suppliers. At the same time, you have also the blue bars, which is instead for each industry, how much the 25 main suppliers are important as suppliers. So the 25 main recipients are important as suppliers. So these are the downstream aspects, right? So this picture is telling you that, of course, the network is dense, right? If you fix a set of main recipients, many industries are both suppliers and customers of those industries, but there is not a one-for-one relationship, right? So you do have industries which are clearly much more upstream, the main recipient of the government spending, and there are industries which are, you could re-rank by the blue line, right? And you would see that you have some separation between upstream and upstream.
The recipients are these like firms?
The recipients now are industries. So the point is that you have the information of the firm. The firm is assigned to a 6-digit count. So this is actually interesting because a firm might have more codes, right? And I think this is a bit of this data is that you record the transaction for the code which is relevant to. So a firm might have multiple codes, but this is by the industry.
And are these contracts usually like open bid competition, or is it more like direct?
Super interesting again. So you know more than me on these things. So we separate. So our baseline is going to be like all contracts, but then we also look just at the competitive contract, which is around 50% of the whole thing. In the new version that you will see hopefully early next year, it's going to be only competitive. And the results are better. So in fact, I'm shooting myself in the foot because I'm presenting you a result which is slightly less nice than the one that will come next iteration of the paper, but my boss is very demanding, so I cannot have a lot of time to devote to this page. Okay, so guys, now the key point though is that this is all nice and qualitative, but any serious research would ask is about identification, right? These all things is endogenous, right? So how do we identify things that we can call shocks to government spending, right? The way typically the literature has done it is to go through a shift sharing instrument, Barattieri type. Here we take a very different approach, and we can discuss over coffee why we think that Barattieri here doesn't work so well. At least I can tell you Ashmoglu agrees with us, so we're not the only one in the planet to think this. But the idea is that here G is potentially endogenous and anticipated. So that what we do is to use a bottom-up identification approach for which we use a 6-digit procurement contract to estimate 4-digit variation in spending, which is plausibly exogenous and unanticipated. And the idea is that we'll have essentially a 2-stage procedure, a third stage where we're going to try to purge from the variation in G all what we can. And we can capture something which is backward looking quite easily. The challenging thing is how are we going to capture something that is forward, right? Because anticipation can also play a role. So we'll see if I convince you of that, but that's kind of the name of the game. How to purge sectoral spending variation of what is potentially endogenous and potentially anticipated. Okay? And so here is where actually we honestly borrow from mine and Matteo's previous work on protectionism the key idea, but the key idea is that we define first an outcome variable on G. So like in this case, we take the change in the annualized level of spending as 6-digit divided by the output yearly, because we don't have, of course, monthly or quarterly output, at 4-digit. Bear with me while we do this weird thing. And then, essentially, this is to deal with seasonality, but then the core of the methodology is to just try to purge this variable of many, many, many factors, right? So some factors are easy to understand, right? We take the past value of employment, for instance, right? Why? Because G might respond, and I'm sorry, I put it on. This is where you want one at a time, but you know, try to follow me and not the slide because it's a complicated slide. So we can purge from fixed effects at the industry level, obviously, for time effects that capture business cycle shocks. These are the easy thing. An easy thing, as I said, is past values of what is our variable of interest in the second stage, right? Because you might think that the government wants to spend precisely in those industries where employment is falling, for instance, right? That's a key example of endogeneity, right? Is employment is falling, so the government tries to sustain the industry, right? So you can consider that, for instance, as a control. And then the most delicate one are the blue objects, right? So the two blue objects are trying to deal with expectations and anticipation. The expectation is captured through what is called the median market to book ratio. So here the challenge is that you need to go at the very granular industry level and have some sort of future expected outcome, right, captured, right? So where do you go when you think about the future? In the stock market. Hopefully not tomorrow, it'd be very complex. But in general, we think that the stock market reflects information about future profitability, for instance, right, of industries. So what we do is we take a firm level data here, thank God it's the US, and we compute the median market to book ratio. So it's how much the market, so how much the market is actually valuing the median firm of the industry relative to the book value. So this is a variable that has a threshold of 1, right? An increase in this variable is saying the market is thinking that the future is bright, and a decrease below 1 is the market thinking that the future is black. Okay? So this is one way in which we try to capture this thing. And most interestingly, we do see that this variable has forecasting power to predict future industry employment growth. So it does bite a little bit. Okay? So it's not completely unrelated as a value. Something less probably even straightforward to understand is instead that we are considering as an anticipation what we call a fiscal year fixed effect interacted with the next 4 industry. So if you ever seen a budget of the United States, don't, because it's like a 10,000 page document, which is huge. But in theory, there is a lot of information, right, about how the government will allocate some of the funding. You know, you can see, you know, the Marines, how many billion will have to buy the aircraft and all of that, right? So this is a very, very, very crude way to essentially capture the fact that many of these expenditures might be anticipated, right? And the example I gave you about Lockheed Martin is a clear example, right? You know, a lot of these contracts are not spot contracts that happen on competition, but they happen actually because there's a long-standing relationship between the government and the firms that pretty well anticipates how much money they will get, right? So obviously for us, that's the problem. We want to exclude that type of variation from the analysis because that would be clearly anticipated, right? So we need the most anticipated shock we can get.
But during the period of time, there is a shock in terms of like wars or whatever, right?
Very nice, very nice. So what we can do next, precisely, is going to be to essentially merge this more parametric way to think about the shocks to a quasi-narrative. So wait a second, So once we pushed out all of these measures, right, which try to deal in some ways with many, many different types of things, what we are left with is a residual, right? That's our object of interest. So this residual is the variation that does not depend on all what I explained to you in the last 5 minutes. That residual, once properly aggregated, because remember, this is the way I had this weird combination of a 6-digit G over a 4-digit output. If I now sum them up across 4 digits, I get a 4-digit level shock for each industry at 4 digits for each time at quarterly frequency. Okay, and this is going to be our measure of the sectoral shock to government spending. And now we can ask, how do they look like, and do they make sense given all what we know about this period, right? And so that's precisely what we're doing now. So now this is a picture where you see the actual, so the blue line for the 12 most important industry. The blue line is the actual, so the measure, and the red line is the predicted. So all the features I told you would predict the red line, which is a lot, right? So what we are using is not really a lot of variation, right? We are taking out a lot of it because we do think, and maybe this is an overly cautious way of approaching things, but we believe that the red line somehow is either anticipated or endogenous. And so the difference is where? So the difference is an interesting thing. So this is my favorite story. You see that there is a big spike. The biggest spike here is 3369. 3369 are the tanks, right? So for each of the main episodes, which we can rank our shocks, we can go quasi-narrow, right? So we can go exactly in the details of which were the contracts, which were the firms, how much were competitive or not, and so on and so forth, right? And there we discover things that makes a lot of sense, right? So for instance, we discovered that while there is a large number of firms and contracts, even in the identified shock, the top 3 recipients get a large share of this spending on average. But then we see also that many contracts feature in the media, right? Or that they are awarded competitively. Or, most interestingly, that, as we say, we don't want to use this as exogenous shock. We say that the timing of various contracts overlaps with exogenous events. So notice this very careful choice of words, because referee can get you very, very angry, right? So you don't have an exogenous shock. We are not saying we have exogenous shock. We say that the timing of various contracts overlap with exogenous events. One example I gave you was clear. So basically in 2003, you see that there is all of this rush into anti-mine purchases, right? And the government said we need to be fast because they're killing us in Iraq especially, right? And so that aligns quite nicely with something which is exogenous, right? Which is not depending on what's happening in the US because it's the people killed in Iraq that determines that. Another very interesting and maybe less known fact are natural disasters. So we pick up Katrina, for instance, right? And all of the spending that goes into buying the trailer for the people who are displaced by Katrina and so on and so forth, right? Which is another example of a plausibly variation that is not determined by anticipation or endogeneity. Is that clear so far? There you go. So now this is what? Recipient upstream or downstream? How do I use this shock? And what do I miss? So these shocks are shocks to the recipient industries, right? So these are the shock to the industry that are receiving the money, right? To be able to understand what's the impact on those industries, I'm fine. But to understand the impact on suppliers and customers, I need to do just one extra step, which is what? Which is combining these shocks with detailed input-output linkages, right? So me and Carmelo are the recipient. Carmelo is the best macroeconomist and historian of economics in Malaysia, so talk to him afterwards. So me and Carmelo are the recipient, and the 4 of you are the supplier, right? So I have the shock for me and the shock for Carmelo, which are these nu hat KT, but then I need to combine them because each of you will have a different importance of us as customer, right? You have 30%, 70%, you have 50-50, you have 10-90, right? So basically what we need to do is something fairly simple. We take these shocks and then we construct what we call our customer shocks in order to identify upstream effects. And we identify supplier shocks for what are called the downstream effects. This is confusing in terms of the terminology, but it's very simple in terms of the concept. Any question on this? You want to throw at me tomato? No. Okay. So then now we are armed with a big set of shocks, right? Because we have the shock to you as a recipient, then we have the shock to you as a customer and to you as a supplier. All clear so far? Good. Next step is called local projection. So this is a very simple tool which is now used in any possible field to try to gauge the impact of something that is plausibly exogenous, so a shock, onto an outcome variable of interest, right? And the idea is that, unlike the people in time series that do very complicated VAR, here we just do a sequence of regression at different horizons. As simple as that. So you have an H step ahead predictive panel regressions, where basically for each step, H0, 1, 2, 3, you're going to see what is the impact on the employment of the supplier, the recipient shock, the supplier shock, and the customer shock. Okay? Notice one thing, that we are using those shocks as instruments. Okay? So this technicality doesn't change if you just put the shock in. We're using them as instruments for the counterpart in terms of just pure G-spanning. Okay? And then effectively what you have is that this beta on is the average effect on the recipient industries at horizon H. This beta up is the average upstream effect at horizon H, and this beta down is the average downstream effect at horizon H. Controlling for all the others, right? Of course. So that's the second technical part. So if you have any question, please stop me, and I will call one of my co-authors and ask to respond. Everyone follows? Okay, so now I think we're ready for the assassin. Are you ready for the assassin? Here's the assassin. So these are the main results. So the total contract on the left-hand side, the competitive contract on the right-hand side. The first panel is what we call the own industry effect. So what is the impact over time? So the horizon is a quarter. So basically here, each blue point is a coefficient regression, a regression coefficient for each of the horizon, right? So you have a time zero effect, a time one effect, a time two effect, etc. So on top, you see the own industry effect, which means the effect on employment on the industry who are recipient of G spending. In the second panel, you have the upstream effect, which means what is the impact on employment on the suppliers of the industry who receives government spending on average. And in the third panel, what you see is what is the dynamic impact on average on the employment of the industry who are customers of recipients of government spending. That is not convinced. Are you convinced?
Continue.
We need to repeat. Who has understood? So what is the medium panel? So as we go back to the original network, right? You remember the four industries. So the first panel is what industry?
The recipient industry.
Oh, which was which one in the beginning? You remember the airspace, right? So that is the airspace industry. What happens to the airspace industry when government spends money in the airspace industry? The second line is energy or steel, right? So what happens in energy or steel when the government spends money on the airspace industry, right? And the third one is air transport. So what happens in the air transport industry when the government spends money on the airspace industry? Okay? Everybody's clear now? Very good. So again, here's where I'm telling you, I'm shooting at me and myself a little bit on the foot because, yes.
Sorry, just to understand the quantity, this is like a shock of
1%.
1% more.
1% of G over Y.
Okay, perfect. Yeah.
Yes.
So the conclusion is basically that the recipient of the funds, the employment is the effect on employment is temporarily high, but tend to go down, and instead on suppliers and customers, the effect on employment is even negative. So there is a decline in.
So you're picking up this one, but I'm killing this in the new results, so you cannot say that. He's also a libertarian, so the G should be 0 for him. so I should give you this background information on him, but certainly not a very Canadian guy. But anyway, yes, you can read it this way. But you need to integrate the response, right? And then we need to go back in time. It's going up, back. We don't know. So the jury is out, but let me tell you one thing. So there is a little bit of a subtle problem. These are all relative effects, right? So this is in parallel regression with time fixed effect. These are not aggregate, right? This is all relative between industries, right? So it's a subtle point, but it's important. Anyway, so I'm saying there is some sensitivity we can skip because we did a lot before. But anyway, different measures, right, gives you similar pictures. Actually, the new pictures, I think it looks much better now that I see the old ones. But let me go to the mechanism. Okay, so why this might be the case, and also why this might be relevant, because I don't know if you know somebody by the name of Daron Acemoglu, but is the Nobel Prize winner this year. He has a famous paper where he basically says that the demand shocks only propagates upstream. So basically, in the benchmark modeling of these issues, which is a paper by Daron Acemoglu and others, the idea was you see different types of shocks propagate through the network in different ways. Productivity shocks propagate downstreams, and demand shocks propagate upstream, right? So you would have the first line and the second line, but the third line should be 0. And why in those models this is the case? Because by some knife edge parameter assumptions on the model, basically what they have is a constant relative price. So essentially, the change in demand in those models does not affect prices downstream, and therefore does not affect quantities. So a simple question, which is very simple, is then, given all this machinery that we had put in place, why don't we look at prices, right? So instead of just looking at the quantities, let's also look at prices. And this is partial. This is very partial. But this is because, in fact, we don't have the downstream. But so as you can see here, we do see some evidence. I should say that, here we have much less data, much less industries, etc. So the result, I think, have to be taken with a little bit of grain of salt. But basically, the idea is that upstream and non-industry price and wages overall tend to increase. Of course, he will say no. But anyway, so the point being, and I'm not showing you here, that if you then use this result to compute what is an average intermediate input price, which is in the paper, I forgot because I forgot how fast I go, that also increases. So the story would be very simple, right? There is a demand shock in air manufacturing industry, right? This has upstream effects, which brings up labor and prices. As a result, the intermediate input prices downstream are increasing, and this is actually what causes the loss in employment, right? The truth is that now we are exploring the mechanism in a much deeper way, and so we are a model network. So, and my friends are right now, even if it's midnight, they are working on this, I'm sure. We are exploring that, in a model to get this result. It's an interesting combination that has to do with how mobile the labor is across sector, and also how much complementarity versus substitutability you have between labor and, say, intermediate inputs. So the story is much more complex than essentially this simple 101 economic story I'm giving you now, but we are honestly discovering it ourselves now, we're in the process. So stay tuned for the next revision of the paper, and you see much more. So we are having now the last 10 minutes on aggregate effects. So as we said, this was all industry level results, which are all partial equilibrium because of this time fixed effect that takes out all the general equilibrium effect. So in order to get some gauging of aggregate effects, we need to move a little bit to a different set, right? And so some people say these are two papers in one, maybe they are, but we'll see. So what we do here, though, is what we have 70 billion contracts, right? So how do we exploit this reach of microdata to gauge some aggregate effect? And the idea we had was effectively to use what is now called the granular instrumental variable approach. So this is a new paper, 2024, JP by Gabet and Kogel. This was published now. So the goal essentially is that you can use idiosyncratic government spending to instrument for aggregate spending. So because, as you saw, the G is very granular and concentrated in a few industries, right? The idea is that if you are able to identify these granular idiosyncratic shocks, that can be used as an instrument for aggregates. And the way this is operationalized is a very simple way. Essentially, this instrument is being built as a difference between a weighted average of the G dynamics weighted by the importance in G and the simple average. And the difference between the weighted average and the simple average would somehow capture the importance of idiosyncratic shocks to G, which are then simply used as instrument for aggregate G. Okay? So this is a different methodology. Now, it's nothing to do with what I said before. It's not network, etc. This is simply using a lot of this information to come up with an instrument that can be used then in a very standard GDP multiplier framework, which is the one of Ramey and Zubery, where basically they explain why this way of estimating the GDP multiplier is smarter, because if you want stuff, yes.
You have information that proves that gets these the recipient industries are also owning other industries that are neighboring them. They're doing their businesses in other industries, and the aggregate increase in GDP is driven by the benefit they would get.
So this is a very interesting question that we did not exploit at all, because as I told you at the beginning, right, our unit of measurement is the industry 60. No?
Yeah.
So basically, 1/3 can receive contract in many different industries, and for us, it's going to be like we are not able. You can, but we don't use the data to distinguish the third, right? Of course, I don't think I will be writing papers on this for 15 years, but I think my co-authors will. And so another step that they're doing is to actually explore more the firm level dimension of the data course. Keep in mind, if you have powerful computers, this is all freely available, right? It's a huge amount of information that can be downloaded from the internet. So basically, here we have a very, very simple idea of how something that Frank Carmelo thinks doesn't exist, which is the fiscal multiplier, can be computed. And so here, the idea is just, again, to use local projection to have the estimation of the multiplier at horizon 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4, etc. And now what we're adding to this is simply that this G, which is the same that they use in the original paper, is not instrumented with the instruments that they used, but is instrumented with this new measure, which is derived from our micro-level data. Okay? And the first answer is very similar to what they get. So there is like, of course, this is a regression with 70 observations. So for the students in there, never do a regression 70 observation, try to publish it. That's why we have all the part before. So this is really an appendix. But as you see, these are numbers around 0.8, which is still below 1, that are in line with the literature. Now, what is cool, though, about this methodology is that we can try to now understand whether different attributes of the industries can result in different multipliers, right? And that you cannot do with the aggregate stuff, right? So you can say, now I'm going to isolate, right? The G that goes, say, to the more upstream versus the more downstream. You understand the point? Because I have the transaction level data, I can say, now let me see what happens if I use only the G that goes to downstream sectors, like services, or the G that goes to more sticky sectors, or the G that goes to sectors where the government is actually a big customer in the sector. Okay, why this is three? This three not randomly, just because there is a mushrooming of theoretical papers. So now fiscal policy network is kind of cool, academically wise. And so many people are writing academic papers with big models where these type of things are found theoretically, right? The combination of these rich data set allows you to try to give some empirical content to these claims, okay? So that's what we do. And what we find is that for some of them, seems to be clearly the case, from other no. So in particular, what is interesting is where I started from, like a fiscal multiplier. So how do you say this? This is upstreamness, so it's the opposite of what I told you before. So the one, the panel on the left means what happens to the GDP if you have shocks only to industries whose level of upstreamness is below the median, which means they're relatively downstream, okay? And on the left-hand side, what happens to the GDP multiplier if you only consider shocks, sorry, if you only consider the instrument, the G that goes to industries whose level of upstreamness is above median, right? So the ones that are more upstream, right? Sorry for the confusion here. If you're still following me, it means that you're really, really enjoying the sentence. And then, in the other two cases, not so much, okay? But certainly, in the first case, as you see, the difference is between something completely insignificant and something which is the double of what you find of what you find in the aggregate, right? And so, essentially, as you always should do, finishing a few minutes before to do some. So the conclusion then of this paper so far is that we exploit micro details on the procurement contract to identify sectoral G shocks. We estimate dynamic responses of sectoral G shock in the recipient industry through the network and in the aggregate. We show how heterogeneous propagation happens through the network, and we show a positive procurement contract multiplier, but sectoral characteristics matters. So this is the end of my presentation. I'm very happy that we had a lot of lively discussion and very smart questions. So we have still 5 minutes. If you have any comments or tomato or discussion, also online at this point, we are very happy to take them.
Any question?
Yes.
Do you look at the budget expenditure by US dollar? What you were doing yesterday? What's the budget allocation for them? So on a year-on-year, you have the financial budget.
Yes. So the idea there would be to try to capture that element with the fiscal year fixed effect, right? Because in the first stage, remember the idea of purging out all of this, precisely because once it's in the budget, somehow the claim is anticipated, right? So yes, we consider it in the sense that we try to exclude it, because it's not a source of variation like Katrina or like Iran, right? It's precisely the type of source of variation that creates a problem of endogeneity, right? But very good question. Yes.
Do you have any intuition on why you saw a negative employment effects on the downstream industries? Like a zero effect makes sense, but like a negative employment.
So the point was, I forgot to put the slide on the intermediate input price, right? But it's really through a price. One potential challenge is the price effect, right? So the price effect is telling you that you have in the recipient industry, you have increasing employment and increasing prices, right? And then in the suppliers, you have the same thing. Now, the customers, no, in the way we are doing this thing, one channel that you're missing is that if the supplier is also supplying directly the customer, not through the recipient, you have a further channel through which the price that the recipients, right, downstream, is paying for its intermediate inputs is going up. Now, the moment that you establish together that the intermediate inputs, right, downstream responds positively and significantly, then that is a potential channel, right? Because basically you are less competitive and you are less able to sell your products. Right? As I said, now we are discovering that the story is much more complicated than that, because in a model that's not enough. You need also to have some level of complementarity. This is a theoretical point. So between intermediates and labor, because I tell you that the price of intermediate goes up, right? So most likely, in a model, what you see is that the use of intermediates goes down. At that point, it really depends how you specify the production function. Because if the production function has full stability, right, you use less intermediate inputs and you could use more labor, right? But if there is complementarity instead, then it makes a lot of sense that as you have less intermediates, you have also less. The empirical estimates for the elasticity of substitution typically are below 1, and so this makes kind of sense. Now the challenge for us is the quantitative aspect of all this. We'll leave this for a beer discussion of how to split that is together.
The shocks, does it captures correlation across the space?
Which is space?
Industry.
So
Industry.
no, so because the space could be like a geographic space, whereas instead you're talking about the network. Okay, so I do think that the shocks capture the aspect of the network, right? That they're designed to do that. One thing that we will not do, which would be also very interesting, is exploit all the geographical variation, right? So here, our unit of observation is the industry at the national level, but here, these data are so detailed that you can use also geographic variation. So you have also that type of network, which of course we are not at all using. Wonderful.
Then I take an answer.
Oh, sure. You have 1 minute.
I will ask in 15 seconds. I mean, I think the first part I really enjoyed, and I think like it has very interesting policy implications, especially on where to allocate the government spending, right?
Right.
On the second part, what would you say that is I mean, because I understand it's more like a contribution of all this literature on fiscal multipliers.
Yes.
Do you find like new resource, so what would you say that is something, because I missed that part.
So because I would argue that exactly what you said, right? So the fact that where you put the money might change the multiplier is coming out of this part, not the first part.
Okay.
Right? So it's the aggregate implications that are the most policy relevant, to be fully honest.
Okay.
The industry level are more an academic cool thing,
Yes.
right? But the one where you go and sit to a minister, you're not talking about downstream crowding out. You're talking about these, and then you might ask why. And you say, because there is network effects for which you have an upstream effect that can dominate the positive effect of the recipients, right? So that's in the sense of our.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Wonderful. Online, good.
How big is the sample size?
What do you mean?
I mean, the firms.
Huh?
The number of firms?
No, wait. So this is it. So the contracts are 70 million. The firms will probably be many thousands, but here we're only using industries, right? So the unit of observation is industries, so maybe 400, and the time dimension is quarterly. So it's maybe 70 observation per minute. So it's 11,000 observations. No, it's not like
The source of the data, which the
USAspending.org.
spending.
Yes, public available. And, it takes a lot of computing power to download these old things. I mean, I can't do that myself. I'm now a bank person, so I only know Excel and PowerPoint. But what is cool is that you can filter, right? And so have sub-download, right? So if you're interested in a specific sector or in a specific time frame, etc., then it's much easier. You download directly in Excel the contracts. That's, so instance, how I got to the 550 billion and our total contract to Lockheed Martin over the period. Wonderful.
Thank you very much,
Thank you very
Alessandro,
much.
for such an interesting presentation. And we can take the discussion outside with some coffee. And see you next week. And my friend Adam wants to take a picture of all you.
Yeah, Alessandro.
Wonderful.
It's first time to the office, so that's all.
And thank you for the people online.
Thank you.